put on a man's jacket and carried my girlfriends up the stairs. Those very muscles made me a speedy curlew and a good sprinter, and I could beat most boys at playground running. But 40s girls' sports were banned from high school track. Yet I had my goals. If Eleanor could triumph over homeliness, I damn well could do the same. No one could be made to feel inferior without their consent, she wrote in my story. Yet without a clue that we were doing femme and dyke, something to be labeled role-playing in the future, my favorite girlfriend and I had our first romance. We were 13. I was her girl gunslinger. She was from the wrong side of the tracks, willowy in those chiffon dresses, reputedly fast with the boys, a real-life Scarlet. But boys weren't kind to her, so she turned to me. I was her girl gunslinger and beat up any boy who teased her. We carried on passionately for a year under cover of sleeping over at each other's houses. Our parents didn't have a clue. It was a book, T.E. Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, that taught me men have these same feelings. T.E.'s memoirs were those of a young British officer, and right on page 2, he got down to brass tacks about gays in the military. As I cried over 7 pillars, with the power that children have to vibe into the collective mind of humanity, Lawrence and his lover essay became part of my world. After a year, my chiffon sweetheart and I drifted apart. Each of us were determined to deal with those monsters called boys. My mother helped me try. It would be years before I would fully appreciate my mother. She headed me quietly toward career, college, and independence, out of her society where a woman's path through the wild grasses was as clearly trodden as a cattle trail to water. Unfailingly, she praised my high school writings, corrected my English, provided me with my own typewriter. Mom had her own dreams. She'd never gone to college, yet eventually she would make her mark as a Montana historian. But surely she had burning questions about where my lack of interest in ladylike behavior was going to lead. So the questions start us on journeys. And fast forwarding today, here we sit in this wonderful auditorium today, all together, all of us having taken our own journeys. Here at the Autry, who has made a very courageous decision to dig into this subject, to open the gate into these questions. And we now have a language to talk about these things, a language that has been laboriously created by many, many thousands of gifted men and women, both gay and straight, over the years since World War II. And often I ask myself, since we're here to really think about the role, the presence of lesbians and gay men and bisexuals and transgendered people in the American West from its earliest times, and by earliest we mean maybe 20,000 BC or earlier, because we recognize and acknowledge that there were gender and sexual orientation differences among Native peoples as well. So we're not just talking about the Pilgrims that got off from Plymouth Rock, or the Spanish who came to the Southwest even earlier than that. But it isn't just a question of the fact that we were here and that we did things, and that we were maybe in the closet, and that we homesteaded land, and we did this and we did that, and we came out to start businesses and to do whatever it was that we did, or that our ancestors did, that we're doing today. I ask myself, how has my journey given me a different perspective on the West, on its history, on its past, present, and future, a different perspective than I might have had if I had grown up straight, even in the time that I grew up when everybody was presumed to be straight. And one thing that comes to mind is, I think that, I can't speak for others. Others can speak about their stories. think that my journey, my stories start with the extreme questioning. And in a really interesting kind of way, the questioning starts with the stories that I heard as a little kid. Uh-oh, I'm seeing a ghost. Why should I not be afraid in this experience I'm having? Why should I be open to what is happening to me in this moment? Who built the mounds? And then on and on through all the different actions that I was thinking about over the years of what the mounds were, why they prayed there, and why they picked mounds, why didn't they pick the riverbank or somewhere else to put the buffalo skulls? Why was it a mound? But the extreme questioning that we are compelled to do when we have to look way from the inside out of ourselves and to understand that we are different than the rules say we are supposed to be, and that the penalties, punishment for violating the rules, stepping over the traces, have been extreme for many people, in many cases their lives. The extreme questioning. Once I deal with myself, my own orientation, who I think I am, and that certainly isn't a question that I've answered yet today. I still ponder a lot of things. But the extreme questioning then goes on to deal with other subjects. Why should I question, why should I accept the standard view on anything to do about Western history? Why should I not look way into the heart of Western history and find things that maybe nobody else has seen, or that maybe only a few people have looked at, and dig into these things and discover the truth and the wonder of stories that have been buried, that haven't been told. So this more and more has become my passion as an emerging historian, is looking for the buried stories, looking here, looking there, to the stories that have been extremely covered up, and finding them in lots of different places. And so the collection of works that are in the book here are examples that simply, when I started going over my magazine writings that I had been done for 40 or 50 years, and I have in my office an entire shelf of notebooks of the tear sheets of everything that I have ever published since the 1950s. Some of it fiction, but most of it nonfiction, ranging from the Reader's Digest and Persimmon Hill and the LA Times to sometimes very, very minor publications, but always publications that had an open mind about the question that I was wrestling with. These were the pieces that spoke to me and said, these are the ones that you should include in this book that you're going to call My West, because it is my West. It isn't anybody else's West. It isn't something that I found on television or in somebody else's book. It's very peculiarly mine. So I'd like to throw the floor open to questions. I'm sure, here we are back to questions again. I'm sure that some of you might have them, and I would be very happy to further discussion or answer any questions that any of you might have. Hands up there?
Also make it some house lights.
Ooh, surely there must be some questions. Ooh, questions, everybody is so nice. Yes, yes, please.
Nobody wants to go first.
Not getting anything. Give us a second. It's on. Carolyn can be loud.
So when you were first turning to your large shelf of writing, what was the hardest thing to meet and selecting pieces for this collection? How did you go about deciding what to include, what not to include?
That's a really good question. I started really by just, thinking of being here at the Autry and my experiences here, starting with the wonderful day when the Brokeback Mountain shirts first came here, and I was lucky enough to be here on that day and feel the excitement, and certain stories just sort of jumped out of the notebook into my hands. And I got this one, no, no, this one. And finally I had a pile. And they very naturally divided themselves into categories. And some of them were pretty obvious, like agriculture, history, politics, animals, women. But then there were some surprises. There was cooking. And cooking was a very important thing in my family. It was all part of the mealtime thing and the sharing of the stories. And we had a very entrenched tradition of good cuisine at the Grant Cours, and not only in the big house, starting with my great-grandmother and all the wonderful German recipes that she dragged over the Atlantic with her, but also in the bunkhouse. Ranches were graded by the kind of food that they served to the men, and you had a hard time hiring people if it was known that the food in the bunkhouse was lousy. So my family always hired hotel cooks for the bunkhouse, and the spread that we always put out, and you can imagine back in the 40s when so many ranches still were self-supporting. We had our own dairy herds, so we had our own milk, our own butter, our own eggs, and a lot of it, our own potatoes that we grew, our own beef that we killed, so we had wonderful resources for cooking. And this was all part of the storytelling thing, and to this day, I love cooking for friends and family. I have a garden, which I've had ever since I dragged my garden all over different places in California where I've lived. And when I moved from LA to Glendale last year, I brought my garden with me as much as I could in big pots. And cooking is important to me, the history of foods and where they come from, and the attitudes that surround them. This very obviously became part of the story. Spirituality, very important issue, because the question is there for lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgendered people, when they come into conflict with the rules in our culture, they very often have a personal decision about spirituality and what that is, and how are they going to handle that issue in their personal lives. Many of our people choose to stay in their churches and to fight the good fight. The Catholic friends that I have, Protestant friends that I have, others choose to leave and to look for a more solitary path. So it was important that spirituality be there as well. And so little by little it all sifted itself out, and wanting to keep everything in balance so that no one category was overwhelming everything else. I finally came up with the 47 pieces that I chose to have in the book. Great question, thank you. Anybody else?
We have more questions, and it turns out it was a user error. The sound man got me all sorted out. So we had questions over here. Let's start here and we'll work our way down.
So I'm so envious of your life growing up with storytellers and then to become one yourself. You mentioned that this came around during the cooking time, during the family dinners. What do you suggest for the new generation, this next generation growing up, who have so many distractions other than? You don't hear the stories coming from this generation. Or do you have any suggestions?
Good question.
You're absolutely right. This is something that I have thought about a lot, and I think a lot of us have been concerned about this, because if the stories aren't going to get told within the family this way, there's certain information, certain not only how it was, but how things can be done, and whatever power the story may have, the kids are not going to hear. Kids are so focused into the age group thing outside of the family. They're so distracted by television and by texting and by telephones and all of the wonderful widgets and so forth. And I think that any family, no matter how close that family is going to have a huge challenge to try to create a mealtime circle. And it doesn't have to be dinner. It can be breakfast, it can be lunch, you could even try competing with the television, have it in the family room. But I think that the best thing to do is to try to start somewhere and to do the best thing that you can with it. And sooner or later, if you try different kinds of stories, you might hit on the kind of story that the children will really listen to. They're so used to having their attention grabbed by stories that you will find the story that suddenly you will see that expression in their eyes, and you'll know that they're listening. So that's my best suggestion, is to just really try. I think the important thing is to start and to see what you can do.
Do we have additional questions? I think we had some down here, and then we'll work our way back up.
Hi, Patricia. I know it's really hard for me to remember stuff. First of all, if there were going to be an unabridged version of My West, how long would it be?
No, not really. That, I would say, actually, I am thinking of a My West 2 at this point. So there are the ones that were kind of like the outtakes, the best of the outtakes. Certainly, probably, 2 or 3 times as thick. There actually is one collection of stories that are very specifically related to the history of the Grand Cours Ranch and my experience there. And those I am going to do in a separate anthology that is going to be really less about me personally than about the place itself, because there are a lot of people who are interested in knowing more about the ranch and why it's important to preserve it. When you go there and visit, any of you that might be interested in going there, what you see is not a restoration. Everything that is there was there. If you go into the harness room and you look at the harness hanging on the walls and the old saddles, those are the ones that were there. If you go into the bunkhouse, it's the original table, it's the original chairs, the original dishes, the old cook stove, old iron beds where the men slept. It's all, we were a family that never threw anything away. And there, in different circumstances, we might have been called pack rats. Or hoarders. But as it happened, the stuff that we were hoarding had historical value. So there was the moment when the National Park Service was invited to visit by the family, and they came in and they looked around, and their reaction was OMG. And from that point on, they were negotiating with the family to buy part of the ranch to open as a National Historic Site. So I think there's room for an anthology that would address interest and further information about the ranch. That I already plan to do.
Oh, cool. When is there going to be a Kindle version of the books? Because I would hand them around, but nobody gets to touch my books anymore. So
pretty soon, we're working on it.
Cool.
Yes.
And this is a personal question. You said the food was really good on the ranch. How did they make the coffee?
Would you like the recipe for cowboy coffee?
Yes.
This is straight from my dad, from the horse's mouth. You build your camp, stop for the night, you build your campfire, you've got your metal coffee pot, you put a pound of coffee into the coffee pot, and you fill it up the rest of the way with quick water. You put it on the fire and you boil it for an hour. And then you throw in a horseshoe. And if the horseshoe sinks, you add more coffee.
Thank you very much. I'm interested if you could share a little more about your coming out story, and particularly, are you still in touch with the 13-year-old friend of yours?
Unfortunately, no. She went her way and I went mine. And actually, one time after we graduated from high school, because we were in the same class, I was back at Deer Lodge from being in college, which was Stevens College in Missouri. And I happened to run into her at church, and she was there. She had gotten married, and she had a baby, and she was there to have her baby baptized. And that was the last time I ever saw her, and it was very sort of guarded at that point, because we were both still deep in the closet. I don't know what she remembered or how she saw it, but it certainly was branded pretty deep in my brain. And so that was, and I never saw her again. So this is why I don't mention her name, because I don't know where she is, if she's still alive, and it would be her decision and her right to talk about this with her name on it.
Can you share a little about how it was coming out to your family, or if you did, and what it was like in the workplace in terms of like Reader's Digest or
Well, the family coming out, so here's a couple, one or two good stories. Because like many people in the closet, I built it up and tortured myself for years about what my family was going to say. But finally, when the front runner was in galley proofs. And I knew that it was going to be coming out in April 1974, and that was definitely going to be the end of the official closet for me, so I had better get my rear end out to Montana before the book came out, and just, you know, have the respect of my parents of letting them know ahead of time if what they were going to have to brace themselves for. So I got on the plane and went out with a copy of the front runner. It turned out that my mother had always known. Not surprising after all the battles that she had to get me out of my dirty jeans and muddy boots and into dresses. And if you notice, I'm wearing pants today. Don't hardly own a skirt. And my dad was a little bit less forthcoming, but he was, you know, grumph, you know, we understand, but that was kind of all that he said. But obviously my parents were going to have to deal with the local politics entirely on their own. I got on the plane and went back to New York, resumed my job at the Reader's Digest. The book came out, it was on the New York Times bestseller list. So this is what my parents did. My mother had she had always had big, strong female networks in town. She belonged to the Women's Club, she was the organist in church, she belonged to Order of the Eastern Star, she was in very deep with all of the pillars of society. In Deer Lodge, especially the women pillars of society. And because they loved my mother and respected my mother, if my mother came along showing understanding, they were prepared to show understanding. And you understand, not a word was said, because this was small town and cowboy country, and so there were not a whole lot of discussions, and people were still struggling with the language of all of this in Montana. But do you know, to this day, I go to Montana, and my mom's friends, and the children of my mom's friends, those networks were still in place, and by golly, they're on my side. And hardly a word was said. My dad's approach was very different. He had political stuff to deal with that was bigger than Deer Lodge. He had served on he had been head of the Montana Livestock Commission. He had been president of the Montana Stock Growers. So he had certain political parameters that were going to be very challenging for him. So this is what he did, very quietly, and he never told me about what he did. He went to the local bookstore in town, which was owned by a cousin of mine named Dean Tavner, and he ordered an entire case of front-runner hardcovers. So then he kept this case of books in his office, and very quietly, over the next few months, he would take one of these copies and he would be on a trip to Helena to drop by the accounting firm that did the ranch accounting, or maybe he was going to visit some senator or other that he was lobbying about something, or maybe he would go to Butte to hang out with his cronies at the stockyards, which he usually did once a week, and so they could all have coffee and complain about how bad the cattle market was and so forth. And he would have this copy of the front runner with him, and at a certain moment in the conversation he would say, by the way, this is my daughter's new book. You all know my daughter, she's a published author, and he said her newest book is on the bestseller, the New York Times bestseller list. Isn't that great? And he would kind of stare at it. And the message was sent, and the message was received that blood is thicker than water. And don't dare say anything against my daughter's book, or the 3030 will come out of the boot in the back of my pickup. And typically of my dad, he never told me that he had done this. And many, many years later, in the 1980s, when I was working on my historical novel, One is the Sun, I went to Santa Barbara to visit my godfather, Ralph Miracle, who was probably my dad's closest friend. They had grown up in Helena together, and Ralph had been the secretary of the Montana Stock Growers Association for more years than anybody would want to remember, and he was now retired, and he and his wife were living the life in Santa Barbara. So I went to visit them, and it was Ralph who told me the story. And we were in the library, he reached up on the shelf and pulled out the copy of the front runner that my dad had given him. Still there. So, thanks to my parents, there has been a solidity of sorts in my home state, a foundation that I've had under me that I'm extremely grateful for, because it didn't necessarily have to turn out that way, but it did. Okay, we have
We have time for 2 more, and then we want to get into the bookstore so that you can all get copies of this really fantastic work.
Can you tell the story about his shirt?
The what?
That shirt he found to support you that you couldn't believe he got his hands on?
Oh, okay, yeah, that's a good story. Okay, that's a good story to end with. All the years that I lived back in New York working in the media, there was always the long plane flight to Montana to visit the folks, and my dad would always meet me at the airport in Butte. And so this story starts in the 1960s. The country was going up in smoke and flames about hippies and free love and dope and the Vietnam War and all of the other issues of the 60s. And the older people here in the audience will probably remember a speech that was given at that time that created enormous waves of comment around the country, and that was Spyro Agnew's speech about the rotten apples. Anybody remember that speech?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Rotten apples. We've got to get the rotten apples out of the barrel. And by that he meant the hippies and the dopers and anybody who didn't agree with people like himself. And at that time they were talking about opening up the old internment camps in the desert where the Japanese people had been kept during World War II, and the whole idea was that all the hippies and dopers and feminists and everybody would be put into camps. And it was a pretty scary speech for anybody who was left of center politically. But that speech just ignited something in the country, and you could just hear it. It was picked up by newspapers and all over it. Even the Reader's Digest reprinted it, and I was working there as a copy editor, so I had to copy read the damn thing. And rotten apples all over the country. So I get to Deer Lodge the next time I went, and there's my dad meeting me at the airport in his cowboy shirt and the big hat, and he always dressed up a little to come pick me up off the plane. And we get home, and we're sitting in the kitchen drinking cowboy coffee, and we're complete with the horseshoe, and we're talking. And my dad is vibrating with this speech. And you remember I said they were Republicans. You know? Oh, we ought to get the rotten apples out of the barrel. And I was just really shocked at hearing my dad use this language. And I sat there trying to think of what I was going to say. And he kept talking about the rotten apples, and finally I just said, "Pop, did it ever occur to you that one of those rotten apples is me?" Oh, this is even before I came out. No. But I'm already on the rotten apple side of the aisle. And he kind of looked at me on that face of his, all weather-beaten and bronzed from, many years on the tractor in the hot sun. And he didn't say anything. He just kind of let it pass, and I decided to let it pass. And so anyway, fast forward to maybe 6 or 8 months, I went back again for another visit. And I'm getting off the plane. This is before jetway, so you go down the steep stairway and you walk across the concrete, and I could look in through the windows of the lobby of the Butte airport, and there was my dad in the cowboy hat, and he was waiting for me. And I get in there, and he's walking toward me, and he's wearing a cowboy shirt, which he always did. But this was not your normal Pendleton plaid, run-of-the-mill cowboy shirt with the pearl button. It had the pearl buttons and it had the piping and everything, but it was purple paisley. Something that maybe the world champion bronc rider would wear coming out of the chute, but you could get away with that. But my dad in purple paisley, this was something else. And my jaw just dropped. He walked up to me and gave me a big hug, and I said, "Pop, where in the hell did you get that baggy shirt?" And he said, "Nah, I gotta keep up with my hippie kids." His answer. It took 6 or 7 or 8 months, but that was his answer. And we didn't have to even have the conversation any further. He'd made it very clear where he stood. I want to thank you all very much for coming and sharing the stories with me and your wonderful questions. And I also want to thank the Autry from the bottom of my heart, from Mrs. Autry right down to everybody on the staff that I have dealt with. You have all been so wonderful. I just want to say how proud I am of the trail that you are blazing, and believe me, it's a nice wide one. I noticed that Michael Jackson now has some of his Western wear here. I think that's just an incredible thing. It really shows that the Autry is out there to make a difference, to show how diverse, how deep, how wide, as big as the West it is all of the stories that can be gathered here together under one roof. I think it's really a wonderful thing. I feel honored to be part of this, excited to be here today. I want to thank all of you for coming, and bless you all.